10 secret spots in Australia the government doesn't talk about. Australia doesn't hide countries, it hides paperwork. Somewhere between the tourism brochures and the 6 o'clock news, there's a shadow version of this continent. Places the government has fenced off, guarded, or quietly erased from the map. Some are radioactive, some are guarded by men with the legal power to jail you. None of it is folklore. Every date and number in this video sits on the public record, a royal commission, a sealed court file, a class action settlement, if you know where to dig. Number 1 on this list is still operating right now while you're watching this, and getting too close can still get you arrested. Number 4 used to be a real town. The government made it disappear. We'll get to all of it. Let's start small. Number 10. Beecroft Weapons Range, New South Wales.
200 kilometres south of Sydney, on the northern headland of Jervis Bay, there's a stretch of coastline with some of the whitest sand and clearest water on the entire New South Wales coast. You can only get to most of it a few weeks a year. The Beecroft Peninsula, 4,200 hectares of it, belongs to the Department of Defence and has, since the 1800s, used today as a live-fire naval gunnery range where warships shell the cliffs from offshore during training exercises. The gate opens for the public during school holidays, weather permitting, on Defence's schedule, not yours, and even then, only certain beaches and tracks are cleared. Wander off the marked paths and you're walking through decades of unexploded ordnance, live ammunition that never went off, half buried in the sand, waiting for someone to step on it or dig it up thinking it's driftwood. It isn't classified, it isn't secret in the dramatic sense. It's simply, permanently, quietly off limits, and most Australians driving past on the South Coast Highway have no idea one of the most beautiful beaches in the state sits behind a defence checkpoint a few kilometres from the road, guarded not by soldiers, but by paperwork and weather closures. That's the pattern you're about to see over and over on this list. It's rarely a wall with barbed wire. It's a form nobody fills out, a gate nobody's allowed through, a reason nobody's actually given. In 2022, local residents and rock climbing groups started spreading rumours that Defence planned to shut the whole peninsula permanently. Access had been steadily tightening for years, with no real public explanation offered. Defence eventually issued a short statement denying any permanent closure and blaming storm damage instead. Whether that's the full story or just the version that made it into a press release is something nobody outside the base can actually verify.
Number 9. Somerton Beach, Adelaide. On the morning of the 1st of December 1948, 2 men exercising racehorses along Somerton Beach noticed a well-dressed stranger lying against the sea wall, legs crossed, one arm outstretched, as if he'd simply drifted off to sleep. He was dead. He carried no wallet, no identification, and every single label had been carefully cut out of his clothing. Not torn, cut, deliberately. In a small fob pocket sewn shut inside his trousers, investigators later found a tiny scrap of paper torn from an extremely rare edition of a Persian poetry collection, printed with 2 words, Tamam Shud. It means, roughly, it is finished, or it is over. 3 separate doctors examined the body and agreed on exactly one thing, that his death was almost certainly not natural. But none of them could identify a cause, a poison, or a weapon. No dental records matched anyone on file. No fingerprints matched anyone on file, anywhere in the world.
For 73 years, the case sat there, feeding decades of theories. A Cold War spy caught with a coded message, a jilted lover, a smuggler, a man erased on purpose by people with the resources to erase a man completely. What kept the mystery alive wasn't just the strangeness of the death, it was the strange behavior of the authorities investigating it. Key case files were quietly sealed for decades. Requests to exhume the body and finally run modern forensics were knocked back for years, before a sustained public campaign forced South Australian authorities to agree in 2021. DNA pulled from hairs preserved in the man's death mask pointed researchers by 2022 to a name, Carl Webb, a Melbourne electrical engineer who had vanished from public records the year before his death. Police have still never fully confirmed that identification using DNA taken from the body itself, so technically the file is still open. A South Australian police spokesperson, asked about the DNA match when it made international headlines, offered a response that managed to say almost nothing at all. Cautiously optimistic, they called it, that this might finally provide a breakthrough. Cautiously optimistic, after 73 years, one exhumed grave, and a code nobody has ever cracked. Whatever actually happened on that beach, it took the government 7 decades to even admit there was a real question worth answering properly. Number 8. Woomera Prohibited Area, South Australia. Try to picture a piece of restricted government land, roughly the size of England, sitting almost entirely empty in the middle of South Australia. With its own private airspace, the Royal Australian Air Force can shut down at will, without warning, whenever it wants. The Woomera Prohibited Area covers about 122,000 square kilometres, the largest land-based weapons testing range anywhere in the Western world. And at its Cold War peak, it was more than twice that size, stretching all the way to a satellite range in Western Australia. Britain wanted somewhere to test long-range missiles where nobody would notice, or complain, or ask questions. And for a stretch in the late 1950s and early 60s, this patch of red outback dirt had the second highest number of rocket launches on the entire planet, behind only NASA's own launch pads in Florida. It's still active today. Foreign militaries and private aerospace companies quietly lease space inside it to run trials the Australian public will never hear about unless something goes badly, visibly wrong. And Woomera carries a second, more recent silence layered directly on top of the first one. Between 1999 and 2003, this same restricted zone quietly hosted one of the country's most notorious immigration detention centers, where asylum seekers, including children as young as 7, staged hunger strikes, sewed their own lips shut in protest, and attempted mass breakouts that made international headlines for a brief, uncomfortable moment before the government closed the facility down and let the story fade back into the dust it came from. There's a highway that cuts straight through the edge of all this today. A sign along it tells you not to leave the road. Nothing on that sign tells you why. 6 different Aboriginal groups, the Maralinga Charucha, the Anangu Pitjajara, Yunkunyujajara, and 4 others, hold traditional or native title rights over sections of this same restricted land. Their country folded in around missile debris and rocket fragments that still surface from the ground after heavy rain, decades after the launches that put them there.
And the detention centre wasn't a footnote. At its worst in 2002, dozens of detainees inside the fence went on hunger strike simultaneously, some sewing their own lips together in protest at conditions the government wouldn't let journalists photograph directly. The images that did leak out, grainy, smuggled, unofficial, did more to change Australia's immigration debate than almost anything since. The fences came down in 2003. The prohibited area around them never did. Number 7. Williamtown, New South Wales. In September 2015, residents of a quiet farming community just outside Newcastle discovered, not from the government, but from a leaked internal report, that the groundwater underneath their homes had been contaminated for decades. RAAF base Williamtown had used a firefighting foam containing PFAS, a group of industrial chemicals now nicknamed Forever Chemicals, because they simply do not break down, not in soil, not in water, not inside a human body. The base had been using them since the 1970s. Families in what the government came to call the Red Zone had been drinking bore water, eating fish caught from the local creek, and growing vegetables in contaminated soil for years, without a single warning from the department that had put the chemicals into the ground in the first place. When residents finally banded together and launched a class action against the Department of Defence in 2016, the government's first serious response wasn't compensation, it was a fighting fund. Tens of millions of dollars specifically budgeted for legal fees to defeat its own citizens in court. One local campaign organiser put it bluntly at the time: Defence had effectively launched a war of attrition against the very community living downstream from its own base, betting the residents would run out of money and resolve before the government ran out of lawyers. It took nearly 5 years of litigation before residents in Williamtown, alongside 2 other contaminated communities in Queensland and the Northern Territory, finally won a combined settlement worth more than $200 million in 2021. Not an admission that PFAS had definitely made anyone sick, just compensation for lost property value and years of what the settlement documents dryly called distress and vexation. The chemicals themselves are still sitting in the ground. They'll still be there in 100 years. Because that's what forever means in forever chemicals. And the same Department of Defense has since quietly confirmed PFAS contamination at more than 90 other sites scattered across the country, most of which most Australians have never once heard mentioned on the news. Quick pause here.
If a contamination zone like this can exist a few hours from Sydney's CBD and still stay almost invisible to the rest of the country, imagine what's sitting in the genuine middle of nowhere, thousands of kilometers from the nearest news camera. That's exactly where the rest of this list is headed. Subscribe now if you want to see where it ends, because from here, it gets considerably darker. Number 6. Cheviot Beach, Point Nepean, Victoria. On the 17th of December 1967, the Prime Minister of Australia walked into the ocean at a beach with a well-known local reputation for savage, unpredictable rips, and never walked back out. Harold Holt had gone there specifically because it was restricted.
Point Nepean had been off limits to the general public for over a century by that point, first as a quarantine station, then as a military training zone, and Holt, an experienced spearfisherman who genuinely loved the water, held a standing pass to use the beach precisely because almost nobody else could. 3 of the friends who drove out with him that morning refused to go anywhere near the water. 1 waded in briefly and stayed close to shore. Holt swam out further, was caught in the current, and simply vanished in front of the small group watching from the sand. It triggered one of the largest search and rescue operations in Australian history. Navy divers, helicopters, hundreds of personnel combing the coastline for days, and it produced nothing. No body was ever recovered. Not then, not since.
What followed was decades of conspiracy theory, submarine defection to China, assassination, a staged disappearance to escape political pressure. Theories fueled partly by one very real, very strange fact that nobody has ever fully explained. Police quietly removed certain papers from Holt's briefcase in the hours after his death, acting on the direct order of the Governor-General, for reasons that had nothing to do with the drowning itself and were never disclosed to the public at the time. A formal coronial inquest didn't officially close the case until 2005, 38 years later, ruling it a straightforward accidental drowning and nothing more. Nothing more, officials insisted, closing the file for good.
Cheviot Beach itself remains closed to swimmers today, visible only from a lookout on the hill above it, inside a national park that also holds Fort Nepean, a genuine 19th century coastal fortress, complete with underground gun tunnels, famous for firing what's widely believed to be the first Allied shot of the entire First World War, aimed at a German cargo ship trying to slip out of Port Phillip Bay just hours after war was formally declared. Number 5. Montebello Islands, Western Australia. There are signs posted on these islands today, actual physical warning signs more than 70 years after the fact, telling visitors not to spend more than an hour a day near certain patches of ground. In October 1952, Britain detonated its first ever atomic bomb here, inside the hull of a decommissioned Royal Navy frigate anchored just off Trimouille Island, in a test codenamed Operation Hurricane.
Britain came all the way to the far side of the world because its own territory was simply too crowded to risk it, and Prime Minister Robert Menzies agreed to host the tests without, according to most historians who've studied his private papers, even consulting his own cabinet beforehand. 2 more devices followed in 1956, part of a series codenamed Operation Mosaic. The larger of the 2 was later described by the scientists who studied its fallout pattern as an exceptionally dirty explosion. Radioactive debris from it was tracked drifting over towns in outback Queensland thousands of kilometers away, dusting rooftops and water tanks the residents had no reason to suspect. Witnesses aboard the support ships anchored nearby described a flash of light so intense they could see the bones inside their own hands through closed eyelids and pressed palms, despite being told only to turn their backs to the blast and shield their faces with their forearms. A 1985 Royal Commission later concluded in plain language that the islands had never been a genuinely safe location for tests of this scale, and that the Australian government of the day had been handed dangerously incomplete information about what the fallout would actually do to the mainland downwind. The islands are uninhabited now, technically open to fishing charters running out of Karratha and Onslow, with basic camping permitted on several of them for part of the year. Parks and wildlife staff still routinely remind every visitor that radiation levels near the original Ground Zero sites haven't gone anywhere in 70 years. It's cumulative, they explain. It adds up quietly over a lifetime, whether you happen to feel it or not. What makes Montebello stranger than most of the entries on this list is how casually it slipped back into being a fishing destination.
Charter operators advertise the islands today for their barramundi and mangrove jack, and most of the anglers who book a trip out there have no real sense that the sandbar they're standing on to cast a line was, within living memory, ground zero for a weapon roughly as powerful as the one dropped on Hiroshima. There's no fence around the old test sites. There's no gate, just a scattering of signs, some rusted concrete footings from the original monitoring towers, and the quiet assumption that anyone who bothers to read the warnings will actually follow them. Number 4. Wittenoom, Western Australia. Take out your phone right now and try to find Wittenoom on a map. You won't. In 2007, the Western Australian government formally de-gazetted the entire town, a legal process that effectively erased it, stripping its name from official maps, tearing down every road sign pointing toward it, disconnecting it from the electricity grid.
Between the 1930s and 1966, Wittenoom's mine produced more than 165,000 tons of blue crocidolite asbestos, considered one of the deadliest materials ever pulled out of the ground anywhere on Earth. And thousands of mine workers and their families breathed its microscopic fibers every single day for years, with no real understanding of what those fibers were slowly doing to their lungs. More than 2,000 people connected to this one small town have since died from mesothelioma and related cancers, a toll that Western Australian authorities have openly, publicly compared to industrial disasters like Chernobyl and Bhopal, and the number keeps climbing even now, decades later, because the disease can take 20, 30, 40 years to surface after the original exposure ends. Roughly 3 million tons of contaminated tailings still sit scattered through the gorges surrounding the old town site, right on the border of one of Western Australia's most heavily visited national parks, close enough that tourists occasionally wander nearer to it than they realise. The last standing structures were finally bulldozed after a bushfire tore through in 2022, and authorities still warn that unauthorised entry into the fenced-off contaminated zones can lead to prosecution under state law. There is exactly one part of the town the government has formally agreed not to touch: the cemetery. It just hasn't managed to explain to the families of the people buried there how, or when, or whether they're actually still allowed to come and visit their own dead. And despite everything, the erased signage, the dead GPS pins, the government's own official advice that reads simply, "Stay safe, stay away," people still go. Photos and videos surface online every year, filmed by travelers who drove past every warning, specifically because a town that's been deleted from the map is, for a certain kind of curious tourist, more tempting than one that hasn't. A retired local politician who grew up in Wittenoom summed up the problem better than any government pamphlet has managed to. "Cover something up for long enough," he said, "and everybody wants to go see it for themselves." Number 3. Maralinga, South Australia. 22 kilograms of plutonium-239 was scattered across this land during a series of tests that most Australians alive at the time never fully understood was even happening. Plutonium-239 has a radioactive half-life of more than 24,000 years, which means whatever remains buried in that soil today will still be measurable long after every single person watching this video and their grandchildren and their grandchildren's grandchildren are gone.
Between 1955 and 1963, Britain detonated 7 major nuclear weapons here, directly on the traditional country of the Maralinga Cheviot people, alongside hundreds of smaller, so-called minor trials, several of which involved deliberately burning plutonium out in the open air to study how it dispersed. Trials that ultimately caused more of the long-term contamination than the actual atomic bombs did. The Cheviot people were displaced to a nearby Lutheran mission with little to no real explanation of what was happening to the land underneath their feet. And it wasn't until a royal commission convened in the mid-1980s, chaired by Justice James McClelland, that the full scale of what had occurred finally became public knowledge. A commission that directly, explicitly blamed the Australian government of the time for its complicity and its casual disregard for basic safety, both for its own personnel and for the Aboriginal families still living nearby. Decontamination efforts dragged on for decades afterward and were, according to independent nuclear engineers who later reviewed the work, still incomplete, even when officials formally declared parts of the site finished and safe. The land itself wasn't handed back to its traditional owners until 2009, 54 years after the first bomb went off. There are guided tours running through the old test sites today, but government radiation authorities still routinely test kangaroo meat harvested from the surrounding country before clearing it for human consumption, which tells you far more honestly than any official report ever has exactly how settled this settled land really is. Some of the servicemen stationed at Maralinga during the tests were ordered to fly aircraft directly through the mushroom clouds afterward to collect air samples, with protective equipment that, by modern standards, verged on theatrical.
Decades later, veterans of the program and Aboriginal people from communities near the test sites were both found to have measurably higher cancer rates than the general population. Two very different groups of people, standing on opposite sides of the same fence at the time, who ended up sharing the same delayed diagnosis years down the track. Number 2. Wadjemup, Rottnest Island. Every year, roughly 500,000 people take the 20-minute ferry from Perth out to Rottnest Island, specifically to see the quokkas, small, permanently smiling marsupials that have made this island one of the single most photographed places in all of Western Australia. Almost none of those visitors have any idea they're walking across one of the largest Aboriginal death in custody sites in the country's entire history.
Between 1838 and 1931, the island, known to the Whadjuk Noongar people as Wadjemup, long before it had any other name, operated as a prison specifically for Aboriginal men and boys, some of them as young as 7 or 8 years old, marched here in leg irons from across the state and held inside a building called the Quad, under conditions of severe malnutrition, disease, and forced hard labour. Roughly 4,000 people passed through that prison over the decades. At least 373 of them never left the island alive, buried in unmarked mass graves that sat, quite literally, undisturbed and unacknowledged for generations. Until human remains kept resurfacing during construction work as the island was steadily developed into a holiday resort throughout the 20th century, most notably in 1993, when yet more bodies were uncovered, barely 100 metres from the island's main tourist campground. It took sustained, decades-long Aboriginal activism throughout the 1970s and 80s before the burial ground was even formally protected under heritage law. The Quad itself, the actual former prison building, walls and all, was quietly converted into hotel accommodation, and paying tourists slept inside it for years afterward, with no idea what the building had actually been. Only since 2020, through an initiative called the Wadjemup Project, has the island's own tourism authority begun openly telling visitors this history, holding memorial ceremonies for the men and boys who died there and never made it home. The quokkas are still the main attraction on every single postcard sold in the gift shop.
A Wadjuk elder involved in the reconciliation project described it simply. In Noongar tradition, when people die, their spirit travels west, out to the islands, to the place of the ghosts.
Wadjemup was already considered that place, long before the British arrived and turned the belief into something closer to a prophecy. Today, a sign at the burial ground reads, in the local language, "The past is still present." A message written for tourists who came for the quokka selfies, and if they wander a few hundred meters off the main path, end up somewhere the brochure never mentioned. Number 1. Pine Gap, Northern Territory. 18 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs, past a checkpoint marked with Prohibited Area signage, sits a facility that has never once been fully explained to the Australian public. Not because nobody's asked, but because the honest answer is classified. Officially, it's the Joint Defence Facility Pine Gap, established under a secret 1966 treaty between Australia and the United States, and expanded steadily, quietly, ever since.
Unofficially, locals in Alice Springs have called it Australia's own Area 51 for years, and the comparison genuinely isn't far off. More than 30 white radar domes rise straight out of the flat red desert, each one concealing a dish intercepting satellite communications and signals intelligence from across the entire Eastern Hemisphere, operated jointly, day and night, by the American NSA, the CIA, and Australian intelligence staff working side by side in the same secure rooms. Roughly 800 people in total, about half of them Australian citizens who go home to Alice Springs every evening and can't tell their own families what they actually did at work that day. Approach the perimeter uninvited and you risk arrest under the Defence Special Undertaking Act 1952, a piece of Cold War-era legislation carrying a jail sentence of up to 7 years, invoked formally only twice in its entire history, both times against anti-nuclear protesters who'd cut through the fence.
A government-commissioned report from 1980 concluded, in fairly blunt official language, that Pine Gap would almost certainly become a nuclear target in the opening hours of any war with the Soviet Union. A former Australian Defence Minister later admitted publicly, without much apparent discomfort, that successive governments had simply accepted that risk in exchange for the intelligence benefits the base provided. That admission has never really been revisited, softened, or walked back in all the decades since. The base is still expanding today, right now, and its exact current role in modern satellite surveillance and, according to some investigative reporting, overseas drone targeting operations remains something neither government has ever chosen to fully disclose to the citizens who technically own the ground it sits on. It sits 18 kilometers from a town of 25,000 people, in plain sight, fenced but not hidden, and almost nobody standing outside that fence actually knows what happens on the other side of it. Journalists who've spent years investigating the base describe its cover story, verifying arms control agreements, monitoring military developments, as, at best, an economical version of the truth. Even a former deputy director of Australia's own Signals Directorate, speaking publicly decades after the base was built, could only offer the same carefully rehearsed line every official before her had used, that it's a genuinely joint facility, Australians and Americans working side by side on intelligence that matters.
What that intelligence actually is, who it's used against, and what happens to the information gathered from those 30 white domes once it leaves the valley. That's the part the joint statement never quite gets around to. The land doesn't keep these secrets. People do. If this version of Australia interests you more than the postcards ever could, hit subscribe, because the map still isn't showing you everything.